So Lizanne, you've been the director now for 10 years at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, a gorgeous museum right on the foreshores of the harbour. Talk to me about Australian artists and Australian art. We live in a very global world where you go to the Venice Biennale and you can't really tell the difference between the Australian pavilion, the Canadian one or the Korean one. So tell me, how's Australian art, is there Australian art, does it exist? And how has that changed over the last 10 years that you've been at the museum?
Well, given that in Australia we have one of the longest living cultures in the world in our Australian Aboriginal artists, our Aboriginal peoples, the Aboriginal question is very important in the art world, both in terms of work that does follow a long tradition, but also in terms of younger artists who are working within those traditions, questioning it and dealing with it perhaps in a more political way. So one of the things before I moved to Australia that attracted me was, in fact, the way that Australian Aboriginal art was developing. And it's very integral to the development of the museum. Sometimes we get asked, you know, is this contemporary art when we're doing a magnificent bark paintings exhibition? And our answer is absolutely, it is still part of a living tradition and has every right to be conceived as Aboriginal. On the wider scale, I guess, of course, Australian artists learn a Western type of art, I suppose. They read the art magazines, everything is online, instant access. But I do think there's a way in which some of them are able to forge a particular unique way of looking at the world because of their relationship perhaps to the landscape. If you look at artists like Sean Gladwell, for example, who was in Venice, his work is very deeply affected by his response to landscape and to Australian films like Mad Max. So Australian artists deal with their own culture in their own particular ways, and I think there's some really strong work. Major issue for us is how far away we are, and the more curators we can bring to Australia, the more Australian artists you'll see appearing in different international art world biennales and so on.
So Robert Hughes talks about that, doesn't he, the tyranny of distance, and that obviously can be a positive and a negative. So the negative is that it's such a long way away, but the positive must be that you have a sort of a hotbed of creativity informing itself. So do you see that with the Australian artists?
Not so much. I think the interesting thing is that there's always been a strong trend for Australians to travel anyway. So Australian artists, there are a lot of schemes. You know, the Australia Council, I have to say, is very supportive of studios overseas and so on. So I do think our artists get a lot of opportunities. I'm involved in a Qantas scheme. There's a Young Artists Award. There seem to be a lot of opportunities. And I think that the way in which Australian artists want to go away is very important for them, also for their practice. There is also, I think, a lot of creative cultural dialogue that goes on within Australia. There are people talking about art. I find people generally very open to discussion. So I think artists get a lot of feedback, but it's within a very small community. And I think that's the biggest downside, is perhaps unlike in New York, where you have a much bigger field, more things to compare yourself with, more ways of judging your work. I think that is lacking, and that's why it is so important that the artists travel.
Great. A number of years ago there was a great exhibition that compared Australian painters of the early 1800s and American painters of the early 1800s that appeared in Yale and then I believe toured to Australia. And the remarkable difference I picked up, and was obviously the point of the exhibition, was that American artists were looking at that time at the hinterlands, the inlands of America, with great opportunity. Here was the land of great verdant plains. The Australian artists of that era were looking into the bush with great fear. The unknown, the parched desert. Are Australian artists still responding to their environment, and how are they responding? Is it with a sense of pride or this sense of fear that has existed?
I don't think it's with a sense of fear anymore. I think there's been a growing realisation of the importance of the environment, and there's a very strong environmental artist movement in Australia now. Artists really concerned about climate change, as they are everywhere, and so that's the immediate response now. I think it is also interesting, though, that not that many artists go out into the outback, for example. They tend to travel to Europe rather than go to Uluru, for example. So I think the actual real knowledge of the landscape in the desert sense is actually quite limited. But given that the problems of water shortages and so on have now reached the cities, then I think it's becoming an issue that people realise is everything is interdependent, I suppose, and you're beginning to see that reflected in artists being more active and more political about it.
So is there such a thing as an Australian artist? You look at some of the early artists of 1970s even, and they're using a very distinct palette. And Klaus Moyer, who works in glass, based in Canberra, but German, his work, when he moved to Australia, reflected the palette of, he was an underwater diver. He did a lot of underwater diving. So is there an Australian artist? Are they responding to a local environment?
If you think of someone like, for example, Rosemary Lang, who shows here in New York, certainly some of her work is very much related. Those amazing photographs of the brides over the landscape and the ones that she made in the outback. So some artists do respond very directly. Others perhaps are more just within the general tradition of contemporary art. I'd use that word, the challenges and the questions that are posed by any artist, whether it's painting or whether it's installation or whether it's photography. So I wouldn't say there's a school of Australian art, but there are definitely Australian artists that work with their environment and work with their specific cultural heritage.
Great. In the panel you were just in, you talked about a specific instance where an artist was able to bring about change in Western Sydney. I thought that was a fascinating example of an artist engaging with an environment that normally would not invite an artist in. Is that something that you as a director of a museum see your role is to take artists out to a broader community, to have them engage, or are you really trying to bring artists within your four walls and have them and bring the audience to that engagement?
Well, I have to admit having a bit of a missionary streak. I think it's incredibly important that we demonstrate to the wider public the role that artists can play, both in terms of providing enormous pleasure or wonderful exhibitions when you come to the museum, but also in terms of playing a role within the community, perhaps in terms of stimulating dialogue between cultures, providing ideas about the way we can do things differently, and really ultimately getting people to look at the world differently. And that artists are people like you and me, but they just happen to have their brains wired differently, and they can express and analyse in a different way and ultimately express themselves visually. And I think it's a really strong political agenda, because I think until we can actually show our politicians that our communities want to work with artists and that artists have a relevance to them, then we're not going to change the importance of culture on the political agenda.
Great. A final question. So the museum is an 18th century idea, the idea of you collect everything from A to Z, put it in that large palace, that 19th century palace, and now here we are at the beginning of the 21st century. Has the museum reached the end of its structural destiny? Have we now creating Richard Serra scale works, video works? Has the four walls that we've developed for museums, have they become irrelevant? I
think the museum as a set of walls is just part of the palette. I would describe it more as a hub for a whole range of activities that happen both within and outside. And I think the really important thing is actually not just to challenge that idea that you just have to bring people there. It's just as important to be creating cultural dialogue outside the museum. The notion of collecting is also critical. We're a contemporary museum. If we keep collecting, when do things stop being contemporary? So the question of how you define your collections is a very important one. But I hold very strongly to the notion of the museum as a special space. I always remember the look on the faces of young people when they walk into the museum for the first time. A group of 5-6-year-olds from Cabramatta in Western Sydney who've never been to a museum before, who look with utter delight, intrigued by what they're going to see. And I think the museum can be a space where all kinds of things can happen, where discussions can take place around issues, but also just a place of sheer pleasure. And I think we have to maintain that, even if in this day of technology where people think everything can be done on the internet, nothing replaces the power of the object.
Do you remember your first exhibition?
I do. I remember my first work of art. It was the Salvador Dali that hangs in Kelvin Grove Art Museum in Glasgow, where I was taken to as a child, Christ on the Cross, which was a work that really it inhabited my dreams and nightmares as a child, and I'll never forget it.
Great. All right. Thank you.
Okay.